chasing epiphanies, and welcome to part 2 of this little guide in civil disobedience. Last time we left off on a certain question: when you're a peaceful protester, just hanging out, getting your activism on, and then the police decide to take you in. How do you deal with that? Something that needs to be emphasized is that an activist's work is not done simply because the protest is over. The way of resistance makes it pretty clear. The aftermath is just as important. Consequences. The book doesn't sugarcoat the fact that civil disobedience can land you in prison, get bitten by dogs, fined, abused, harassed, even killed if you're in a vulnerable position. Among the main reasons people don't participate in civil disobedience is due to the fear of these consequences. The way a resistance tries to dispel at least a few of those fears. For example, Pelle and Stellan's accounts of their times in prison makes life behind bars almost sound fascinating. My favorite part is how Stellan finds himself getting respect from the inmates almost right away.
Hey, what you in for?
Robbery.
What you in for, buddy?
Ain't your fucking buddy. Aggravated assault and drug possession.
Uh-huh. And you?
Just sabotaged a nuclear sub.
Holy shit!
He eventually even manages to talk to the inmates and parts of the staff, teaching them about getting organized, starting off small with things relevant to them, like negotiating for better electricity in the building. But, before I get too far ahead of myself, let's not forget about another major event one needs to be prepared for: the trial. Some basic yet important pointers would be to do your research on your local justice system and discuss strategy with accomplices ahead of time. For example, role-playing. This can help prepare you for interrogations, so you know what you can share and what you should keep to yourself. Something that is especially unique to the trial of a disobedient is that usually there is no need to ask whether or not the accused party is guilty. As established in the previous video, as part of their public action, they will admit to breaking the law, while also claiming they did nothing wrong in spite of that. The focus can then be steered toward the ethics rather than the legality. Was this right or wrong? Should we as a society punish this behavior? Is it reasonable that, say, an animal rights activist should have to spend time in prison for freeing a few out of 100,000 chickens and bringing them to a better home? Or if protesters sabotage some weapons or a nuclear submarine, should this be punished? Shouldn't we instead be discussing the irreversible harm that the nuclear weapons could do? These are examples of how the book views the trial like a conversation with society, since you are being judged by its institutions and representatives. It may even get attention in the media if you're lucky, extending that conversation to the rest of the world outside the courtroom. This is yet another reason why the book is in favor of non-violence. You don't want to be on trial for violent actions that you can't rationalize to the people watching. I can't emphasize this enough. Your message can reach people no matter where you are. At home, on the street, in court, or even in the most extreme case, prison. Now, using this same logic, prison time can serve as a statement as well. If perfectly peaceful people are put behind bars, politicians and the justice system can be held accountable. This of course relies on journalists, activists and just people in general asking these tough questions. Why was this person locked away? They were acting perfectly peaceful. Someone that went an extra step in using this rhetorical tool was Gandhi. He often sprinkled in these kind of questions in his speeches and texts. Why do we accept how things are? Why are we bowing down to this or that? Because it's not always enough to just point the finger at the establishment. One can also point the finger at the people who allow injustice to happen. People like Thoreau, the original gangster himself, shared this sentiment, going as far as saying that those who sit by the sidelines doing nothing are the worst.
Well, that's a bit harsh, you might say. The average person is just doing their best to get by. They've got enough to worry about without risking prison time as activists.
Well, let's put a pin in this idea for now. Debunking. There are always going to be critics, some reasonable and some not so much. What we're looking at here are some common counter-arguments against civil disobedience that are easy enough to take down.
It won't actually change anything.
Factually wrong. It's easy to stare yourself blind at authority figures that refuse to budge, but each act can have effects we don't even realize. Real-life example, it might be difficult to bring up the topic of weapon manufacturers in towns where people feel like they depend on it for work. So, when someone sneaks in to sabotage the weapons, suddenly everyone has a reason to talk about it. The activists in question only learned that this was happening way later after the fact. So, yeah, don't assume your actions don't mean anything just because you aren't seeing the results right away. On a related note, some will claim that civil disobedience won't change anything, specifically because it won't use violence. I'll point you to the description where I provided a link to the study Why Civil Resistance Works. This paper shows that out of hundreds of resistance campaigns between the year 1900 to 2006, the non-violent ones had double the success rate. This was measured in terms of how violent campaigns had far less success in attracting material support for the cause, less international aid from other organizations, fewer people switching to the protesters' side, especially politicians, who tend to avoid supporting anything with bad optics.
What if everyone was breaking the law? It would be chaos!
This one is obvious hyperbole. No one is saying that civil disobedience is perfect, nor that it should be used all the time for literally every little thing.
You're just trying to get attention.
All political advocates want attention? But what this is trying to imply, of course, is that the activist is just sad and lonely and just wants attention for the sake of it. Stellan, for example, was given a possible out in his trial if he just admitted that he was doing a media stunt and wouldn't do it again. But instead he declared on the record that if he was let out, he'd get right back to his hammering. This clarified that it wasn't just some one-off act for publicity. He was doing what he believed was right, thus not cheapening his actions.
Destruction of property is violence too.
This argument and variants of it became popular during the BLM protests, as co-occurring riots led to the burning of various buildings. Something that needs to be understood about riots, especially if you want to criticize their optics, is that they're not organized. They're an explosive reaction to injustice. George Floyd was not some isolated incident that caused everyone to just suddenly lose it. It's the result of a consistent pattern of abuse toward the black community in the US,
combined with a bunch of other problems.
Not saying individual responsibilities should be ignored, but if I may inject my own opinion here, what does complaining about it accomplish? Should we not be focused on creating an environment where people won't even need to riot in the first place? Anyway, the way of resistance actually agrees on one point. Using fire or explosives is an absolute no-no, unless you have an explosive expert present that can ensure people's safety. The book encourages people to use simple tools like hammers and wrenches to dismantle things instead. Cause everyone's got a hammer at home somewhere, no specialized education or license needed. It also points out that not all destruction of property is bad. Hammering on grenade launchers and nuclear subs, for instance, this could be argued is just destroying weapons that would do infinitely greater harm to people. In other words, while we should oppose violence toward people, destroying things that you can argue would do harm to the world is a reasonable action that can easily be defended.
What gives you the right? By ignoring the law, you're ignoring the democratic process.
Civil disobedience doesn't necessarily mean you're ignoring the law. On the contrary, it means to respectfully challenge it. After all, by breaking the law, protesters that stand by their actions put themselves in a vulnerable position, where people may judge them, and as such, they open up a conversation about how we actually treat lawbreakers. Laws have changed throughout history, and challenging those laws play a huge part.
But if you're thrown in jail, you'll waste time that could have been spent outside.
This argument comes from a place of sympathy, but there is no guarantee that confinement has to make you less productive. This varies from person to person and place to place, of course, but Stella made sure to note down a list of accomplishments while in UK prison. 550 letters received, 150 answers written, 50 visits, 3 unions officially supporting his group's actions, discussions with 150 inmates and 20 guards, 30 pages of an academic thesis written, 1 article on non-violence published, and helping with organizing a local peace group. All this was done in 4 out of the 6 months he received as punishment. Keep in mind, disobedient groups often have support roles that involve staying in contact with those who get imprisoned, and failing that, one can always look up potential support groups that are already in place. Reality can be harsh though. Activists should be mentally prepared that some days might provide no contact with the outside. Thoreau said that after being set free, he now realized which of his friends could be trusted to improve the world and which ones were just there to discuss the weather, never taking any risks. He saw which people actually kept contact with him and who couldn't be trusted to even do that. It can change a person's perspective in many ways. Thoreau argued that those who complain about the system, yet begrudgingly go along with it, are the worst kind of people. Getting a bit harsh again, are we? Fine, let's put a second pin in this idea and save it for the end. Constructive critique. I'd like to start by giving some of my personal, not even criticisms as much as disclaimers. The Way of Resistance was written by a pair of Swedes and released in 2011, shaped by their experiences in Sweden and the UK, so I think it's fair to say this book won't represent the reality some protesters face worldwide today. It'd be good to look up more reading material that talks of how minority groups experience protests, for example, or more detailed accounts from activists in other countries. Nevertheless, no matter what walk of life you come from, there are some obstacles we all run into. It's absolutely necessary to ensure people are on the same page, so the movement doesn't lose its momentum due to inside bickering. Based on their experience with civil disobedience, the authors leave the reader with some advice so they won't make the same mistakes as they did. For starters, keep the group small, anywhere between 2 to 10 members. We may feel tempted to belong to a group that has strength in huge numbers, but there are ways in which a smaller group can be more efficient. For one, fewer members makes it easier to democratically agree on what to do. But also, it's harder for saboteurs to infiltrate a group of people who know each other, as opposed to a massive protest where the saboteur is just another stranger blending in with the crowd. Something that helps even more with this is to avoid secrecy. If activists make as much as possible of their plans and code of conduct public, the risk of cop infiltrators becomes significantly lower, saving everyone the headache of being suspicious of their allies. These rules of conduct may include things like don't use violence, don't use drugs, express anger without being insulting, etc. Being transparent about this is useful to attract more like-minded members to the movement. And as a cherry on top, it also ensures that members won't need to walk on eggshells when talking to outsiders about their activities. This leads into the next point. Inform your family and friends. It can be a hard conversation to have, but your loved ones, more than anyone else, will need time to adjust to the idea that you're planning something that could get you in trouble with the law. It'll give them more peace of mind and prepare them if anyone were to ask about your actions. To do good by your loved ones is obvious enough. Something that's far less clear, however, is how to treat your enemies. When going up against corporations and companies at the very least, the Way of Resistance would say it's best to stop the protest if those in power can be brought down to the negotiation table. Some will naturally want to keep up the pressure and keep protesting, but this often backfires. An opponent that feels cornered will obviously be less cooperative, but if they're invited to speak as equals, they tend to see the protesters don't quite fit this stereotypical image they have of a violent anarchist punk. To echo Gandhi once more, he wished for civil disobedience to act like this, like a conversation, as opposed to a boxing match, combining force while knowing when to swing with the punches.
Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
As such, there should be an agreed point at which everyone is ready to take a step back and invite the opponent to speak on equal terms. And when you do sit down, provide thought-out arguments. Gandhi and his followers in one case interviewed 8,000 sugarcane farmers, making sure they could present arguments about exactly what they wanted and needed. These are some pointers that help you keep good relations with people outside the group. But what about the people inside the group? If the actual team can't get along, then none of the above is gonna help much. First thing to consider, the power structure. There are many ways to organize, and there's no completely right or wrong answer here. The Way of Resistance, however, favors a sort of representative democracy, wishing to combat what feminist thinker Joe Freeman would call the tyranny of the structureless. The idea being that if there's no formal power structure, informal structures will grow into place anyway. Things will naturally start to favor those with more experience or whoever knows how to play the social game better. Not to mention, if the group consists of a majority of people from one race or one gender or the like, they may get an advantage in getting their voice heard, at least compared to those in the group's minority. Members should therefore be assigned specific responsibilities using reasonable and publicly known criteria. rules need to clarify how long someone can have a role and how they can be replaced. Cause it'd be in everyone's interest to rotate roles, giving each member some experience with leadership, logistics, among other tasks. This will be extremely useful in staving off tensions in the group. For example, there's always a risk that those who end up in prison are seen as the great martyrs and heroes with the biggest responsibility, yet the support group that sends them letters, handles their bills, and other such matters are just as important, if not more in some ways. Making sure roles are made clear from the start can help ensure no one feels like they're given a lesser part to play. Now, regarding the leader role in specific, even if the group doesn't elect a leader to represent them, like in the case of anarchist groups for example, the media may very well latch on to whoever seems most relevant or outspoken. These unofficial leaders might end up representing the movement in the public eye, even in cases where they have no real control of the rest of the group. So it's wise to have one or two representatives that speak with the media, people who have relevant skills in speaking, debating and presenting what the group stands for. Next on the list, have a schedule. This makes sure you get rid of several problems beforehand. For one, people in the group will be less likely to get cold feet and draw out preparations. 2, the go-getter types in the group won't get frustrated during times of slower progress. And 3, the desperate ones, those who feel like the world is doomed unless something drastic is done and it must be done right now, they'll be reassured in knowing that there is a plan. You want to create a certain in-group culture, one that thinks in the long term. Because a few big actions, no matter how spectacular, won't make a difference if they can't be repeated. Speaking of culture, how do we create a good atmosphere and a strong bond between the activists? Well, you're gonna love this one. They suggest adding time for play and books in the schedule. Build trust by letting the team play games with each other and put in activities that include writing text, sharing poetry or discussing books. Not only does this give each member a chance to practice expressing their opinions, it also makes sure that the rest learn to sit down and listen to their teammate. Well damn, when you put it like that, joining an activist group actually kinda sounds awesome! You could make all sorts of friends! Actually, there is one downside to this promise of close comrades. There are those who seek out political groups exactly because they want somewhere to belong. Some have trouble with family, addiction, anxiety. This has led to some groups getting overwhelmed with specific members and the drama they bring. It may be harsh, but the group is not your therapist. If someone on the team suffers because of their activism, like tensions with family who disapprove, that is something relevant that the group should offer support on. But if a person comes in with baggage already, things that aren't even related to the group's activities, then a line needs to be drawn. In these situations, it's better to help these people to seek out professional help. That should about summarize the more poignant pieces of advice found in the text. And I think it's about time we wrap up this video. Closing statements. This book was a journey through a whole jungle of tips and tricks on how to be more efficient with activism, spreading awareness of how we may make a difference. I'd like to take a step back to consider what kind of picture the book has painted, not just with its individual points, but as a whole. I see stories of countless unsung heroes that have been essential in making the world a better place. Between the lines, at the heart of it all, I see a book that believes in humanity. A people united is stronger than any corrupt system. Consider this. Do people in power possess some sort of natural control over others? No, they're given that power by their supporters. Tyrants have no power if no one is willing to follow them. When looking at things from this perspective, power actually lies in the hands of the people. So, doesn't that mean that the ones we truly want to reach aren't even necessarily the politicians or the CEOs of the world, but rather the everyday person on the street? I think this is the true goal of civil disobedience, standing by our beliefs and creating discussion with the aim to make it impossible for those in power to maintain their support. Remember what Thoreau said? That those who begrudgingly go along with a broken system are the worst? From this perspective, it kinda makes sense. If the average person is the true holder of power, then going along with the system they know is broken is not too different from enforcing that system. To him, it wasn't enough to simply be good for the sake of being good. It was more important that people were good in service of a clear goal. The same way that BLM has made it clear that it's not enough to just not be racist. One also needs to be anti-racist and actively stand against bigotry. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who stuck with this two-parter, and I hope you found some worthwhile ideas in all this. You know the drill, like, subscribe, but most importantly, share this around to anyone that might find it useful. Till next time, always remember, intelligence is sexy, so be the sexy you. Black Lives Matter.